October 25, 1942, 30,000 feet above Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Second Lieutenant Edward "Eddie" Callahan was diving toward his own death, and he knew it. His P-40 Warhawk screamed through the tropical air at 400 miles per hour, the airframe shuddering so violently that rivets popped from the fuselage like teeth from a broken jaw. Behind him, closing fast, a Japanese Zero painted with the rising sun insignia on its wings. The most feared fighter aircraft in the Pacific, flown by a pilot who had probably killed a dozen Americans before breakfast. Eddie had made a rookie mistake. Everyone in the briefing room had said so. He had tried to outmaneuver a Zero in a turning fight, and now he was paying the price. The Japanese pilot was on his tail, tracers streaking past his canopy like angry fireflies, and there was nothing Eddie could do except dive and pray. But as the altimeter needle spun backward and the ocean rushed up to meet him, something strange happened, something that would change everything. The Zero did not follow. Eddie pulled out of his dive at 2,000 feet, his vision graying at the edges from the G-forces, blood vessels bursting in his eyes. He looked up through the scratched plexiglass of his canopy, expecting to see the enemy fighter screaming down to finish him off. Instead, he saw the Zero pulling away, climbing back toward altitude, breaking off the pursuit. In that moment, gasping for breath, hands shaking on the stick, alive when he should have been dead, Eddie Callahan understood something that no American pilot had yet figured out, something that the instructors at flight school had never taught, something that would, over the following months, help turn the tide of the air war in the Pacific. The Zero had a weakness, and Eddie had just discovered it by accident. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We bring you stories from World War II that reveal the courage, sacrifice, and unexpected turning points that shaped history. Stories of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary things in the worst of circumstances. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and let us remember these stories together. Edward Joseph Callahan was born in 1920 on a dairy farm outside of Eau Claire, Wisconsin. He was the youngest of 4 children, the only boy, and from the time he could walk, he was expected to work. Cows needed milking before dawn. Hay needed hauling in the summer. Fences needed mending year-round. The Callahan farm was not prosperous, but it was theirs, 160 acres of rolling green pasture that had been in the family since Eddie's grandfather emigrated from County Cork in 1878. Eddie learned early that hard work was simply what you did. There was no complaining, no negotiating, no asking why. You woke up, you worked, you ate, you slept, and you did it again the next day. His father, Patrick Callahan, was a man of few words and calloused hands who communicated approval through brief nods and disapproval through silence. His mother, Mary, was the warmth in the household, the one who snuck extra biscuits onto Eddie's plate and told him stories about Ireland while the winter wind howled outside. What Eddie loved most, though, was not the farm. What Eddie loved was the sky. In 1927, when he was 7 years old, Charles Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean. The news electrified the nation, and Eddie, who had never seen an airplane in person, became obsessed. He cut pictures from newspapers and magazines, pasting them into a scrapbook that he kept hidden under his mattress. He built model planes from scraps of wood and fabric, launching them from the barn roof to see how far they would glide. He lay in the pasture at night, watching the stars wheel overhead, imagining himself up there among them. His father thought it was foolishness. There was no future in flying, Patrick said. The future was in the land, in cattle, in honest work, but Eddie could not stop dreaming. When he was 16, a barnstormer came through Eau Claire, a former Army pilot named Hank Morrison, who had bought a surplus Jenny biplane and was offering rides for $2 apiece. Eddie had saved $11 from odd jobs and birthday gifts over the course of 3 years. He spent 2 of those dollars on a 10-minute flight that changed his life forever. The moment the Jenny lifted off the grass strip and the ground fell away beneath him, Eddie knew what he was meant to do. The farms below became patchwork quilts. The roads became ribbons. The horizon opened up in every direction, infinite and free. For those 10 minutes, Eddie Callahan was not a farm boy from Wisconsin. He was something else entirely. He spent another $4 on 2 more flights. When his money ran out, he asked Hank Morrison if he could work in exchange for lessons. Morrison, who recognized something of his younger self in the eager boy, agreed. For the next 2 summers, Eddie split his time between the farm and the grass airstrip outside town. He learned to pre-flight an aircraft, to check oil and fuel, to spin the propeller to start the engine. He learned the basics of flight, how to take off, how to climb, how to turn, how to land without killing yourself. By the time he was 18, he had logged nearly 50 hours of flight time, mostly in battered trainers that Morrison had acquired from various sources of questionable legality. In 1940, with war raging in Europe and tensions rising in the Pacific, Eddie made a decision. He would join the Army Air Corps. He would fly for his country. He would finally, fully, become the pilot he had always dreamed of being. His father said nothing when Eddie told him. His mother wept. His sisters hugged him and made him promise to write. Eddie Callahan shipped out for basic flight training in January 1941. He was 20 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, 160 pounds, with brown hair, grey eyes, and a quiet confidence that his instructors mistook for arrogance. He would learn, over the next 2 years, that confidence and arrogance were very different things, and that the line between them was often written in blood. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was, in late 1941, the finest carrier-based fighter aircraft ever built. Designed by the brilliant engineer Jiro Horikoshi, it combined extraordinary range, exceptional maneuverability, and devastating firepower in a package that seemed almost magical to those who encountered it. The Zero could outturn any American fighter. It could outclimb them. It could stay in the air for 8 hours on a single tank of fuel, giving it the ability to strike targets that should have been beyond reach. In the hands of experienced Japanese pilots, many of whom had been flying combat missions over China for years, the Zero was a weapon of terrifying efficiency. When the Pacific War began on December 7, 1941, American pilots learned these lessons the hard way. Over Pearl Harbor, over the Philippines, over Wake Island and Malaya, Zeros swept through the sky like avenging spirits, destroying everything in their path. Allied pilots who had been trained to dogfight found themselves hopelessly outmatched. The standard tactics, get on your enemy's tail, turn with him, wait for a shot, simply did not work against the Zero. It could turn tighter, climb faster, and roll quicker than anything the Americans had. The kill ratios were catastrophic. In the first months of the war, Japanese pilots shot down American aircraft at rates of 10 to 1 or higher. Veteran pilots died, replacement pilots died faster. The Zero became the symbol of Japanese air power, and American pilots learned to fear the sight of that distinctive silhouette, the long, graceful fuselage, the round engine cowling, the red circles on the wings. What the Americans did not know, could not know, in those early months, was that the Zero's greatest strengths were also its greatest weaknesses. To achieve its remarkable performance, Jiro Horikoshi had made deliberate sacrifices. The Zero had no armor protecting the pilot. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was built as light as possible, using thin aluminum skin that could be punctured by a single well-placed bullet. In a turning fight, the Zero was unbeatable, but it could not take punishment and it could not dive. The Zero's lightweight construction meant that at high speeds, the controls became stiff and unresponsive. Above 350 miles per hour, rolling the aircraft became difficult. Above 400, it became nearly impossible. And the airframe itself was not stressed for high-speed dives. Pushing a Zero too hard in a descent risked structural failure. These weaknesses were known to Japanese pilots who had been trained to avoid situations that would expose them. But they were not known to American pilots, who had no way to study a Zero up close, no manuals to read, no captured aircraft to examine. The Zero was a mystery wrapped in propaganda, a myth as much as a machine. Eddie Callahan arrived in the Pacific Theater in August 1942, assigned to a fighter squadron based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. He was a freshly minted second lieutenant with 200 hours of flight time, most of it in trainers. He had never seen combat. He had never fired his guns at an enemy aircraft. He had never watched a friend die in a fireball at 20,000 feet. He would experience all of these things within his first 2 weeks. The squadron commander, A weathered major named Thomas Webb gave Eddie and the other replacement pilots the same briefing he gave everyone. Forget everything you learned in flight school. The Zero is better than anything you have flown against in training. It is faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots who have been killing people since before you learned to shave. If you try to dogfight a Zero, you will die. If you try to outturn a Zero, you will die. If you try to outclimb a Zero, you will die. Your only chance is to use the advantages you have: speed, firepower, and armor. Hit them fast, hit them hard, and get out. Do not give them a fair fight. Fair fights get you killed. Eddie listened. He nodded. He thought he understood. He did not understand at all. Eddie's first combat mission was a patrol over the waters north of Guadalcanal, looking for incoming Japanese bombers. He flew as wingman to a captain named Robert Bobby Chen, a Chinese-American pilot from San Francisco who had joined the service despite the suspicious looks and whispered slurs that followed him everywhere. Bobby was an ace, 5 confirmed kills, and he had volunteered to shepherd the new pilots through their first missions. "Stay on my wing," Bobby told him before they took off. "Do what I do, do not try to be a hero." Eddie promised. He meant it. The patrol was uneventful for the first 2 hours. They flew lazy circles over the blue Pacific, the sun blazing overhead, the radio crackling with occasional chatter from other flights. Eddie began to relax. Perhaps war was not as terrifying as he had expected. Perhaps the stories had been exaggerated. Then the call came in. Bandits inbound bearing 320, altitude Angels 20, estimated strength 12 aircraft. Bobby turned toward the heading without a word. Eddie followed, his heart suddenly pounding so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. He checked his guns, checked his fuel, checked his oxygen. Everything was working. Everything except his nerves. They climbed to intercept, joining up with 4 other P-40s from the squadron. 6 Americans against 12 Japanese. The math was not encouraging, but it was better than usual. Eddie saw them first. Tiny specks against the clouds, growing larger with impossible speed. Zeros in a loose formation, escorting a group of Betty bombers headed for Henderson Field. The bombers were the priority target, but the Zeros were the threat. Bobby's voice came through the radio, calm and flat. "Tally-ho. Let us go to work." The next 90 seconds were the most chaotic of Eddie's life. The 2 formations merged in a swirling melee of tracers, engine smoke, and screaming metal. Eddie lost sight of Bobby almost immediately. He saw a Zero flash past his nose, so close he could see the pilot's goggles. He squeezed the trigger and felt his guns roar, but his shots went wide, vanishing into empty air. Then another Zero was behind him. He heard the bullets hitting his aircraft before he saw the tracers, metallic pings and thuds against the fuselage, a spider web of cracks appearing in his canopy. Instinct took over. He yanked the stick hard left, trying to turn, trying to get out of the line of fire. It was exactly the wrong thing to do. The Zero followed him effortlessly, cutting inside his turn, gaining angle with every second. Eddie pulled harder, his vision narrowing as the G-forces mounted. The Zero was still there, still closing. He could see the winking muzzle flashes from its guns. In desperation, Eddie did the only thing he could think of. He rolled inverted, pulled back on the stick, and dove. He did not dive gently. He dove with everything the P-40 had, the engine screaming in protest, the airspeed indicator climbing past 300, then 350, then 400 miles per hour. The controls grew heavy, sluggish. The airframe shuddered. Eddie was certain the wings were about to tear off, but he was also pulling away. The Zero, which had been 50 yards behind him seconds earlier, was now 100 yards back, 200, 300. It was not following him down. Eddie kept diving until his altimeter showed 2,000 feet. Then, with aching arms, he hauled back on the stick and pulled out, the ocean filling his vision before the nose came up, and he was climbing again, alive, shaking, alone. The Zero was gone. It had broken off, climbing back toward altitude, rejoining the fight above. Eddie flew back to Henderson Field on autopilot, his mind racing. What had just happened? Why had the Zero stopped chasing him? The Japanese pilot had him dead to rights. A few more seconds, and Eddie would have been a fireball. But the Zero had simply let him go. He landed with 11 bullet holes in his aircraft and no confirmed kills. In the debriefing tent, he tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and uncertain. Major Webb listened with an expression of weary patience. "You tried to turn with a zero," Webb said when Eddie finished. "That is the rookie mistake. You are lucky to be alive." "Yes, sir, but at the dive. When I dove, he did not follow. He could have caught me, but he pulled off." Webb shrugged. Maybe he was low on fuel. Maybe he had another target. "Do not read too much into it, Lieutenant. You survived. Learn from it and move on." Eddie tried to move on, but he could not stop thinking about that dive. Over the following weeks, Eddie flew more missions. He saw more combat. He watched friends die, Bobby Chen among them, shot down over Iron Bottom Sound on an escort mission in early November. He learned to suppress his fear, to focus on his instruments, to follow orders. He became, by the grim standards of Guadalcanal, a competent combat pilot. But he also kept thinking about that first engagement, about the Zero that had not followed him down. He began asking questions. In the mess tent, in the ready room, on the flight line, wherever pilots gathered, Eddie asked, had anyone else noticed that Zeros did not dive well? Had anyone else escaped by running away at high speed rather than trying to turn? Most pilots dismissed him. The Zero was invincible, they said. The only way to survive was to avoid it entirely. Diving was just as dangerous as turning. You might escape one Zero, but you would find yourself at low altitude, slow and vulnerable, easy prey for the next one. But a few pilots, the veterans, the ones who had survived long enough to have opinions, said something different. "The Zero does not like to go fast," one of them told Eddie, a lieutenant from Texas named James Whitaker who had 6 kills to his name. "I have noticed it too. When you dive away, they break off. I always figured it was because they wanted to stay with the bombers, but maybe it is something else." "What if it is the aircraft itself?" Eddie asked. "What if they cannot follow us down?" Whitaker considered this. If that were true, someone would have figured it out by now, the intelligence boys, the engineers, someone. Would they? How would they know? We do not have any captured Zeros. We do not have any manuals. All we have is what we see up there, and most of the guys who get close to a Zero do not come back to tell anyone about it. Whitaker had no answer to that. Eddie began keeping a notebook. After every mission, he wrote down everything he could remember. Not just his own experiences, but the stories other pilots told, the patterns he was starting to see. He noted the altitudes at which engagements began and ended. He noted the speeds at which Zeros seemed to break off pursuit. He noted the maneuvers that worked and the ones that got people killed. By December, he had filled 3 notebooks with observations, and he had developed a theory. The Zero, Eddie believed, had a speed limit, not a theoretical limit, but a practical one, a speed above which the aircraft became difficult or impossible to control. He estimated this limit at somewhere between 350 and 400 miles per hour, indicated airspeed. Any American pilot who could reach that speed and maintain it could escape a Zero. More importantly, an American pilot who understood this could use it offensively. The standard tactic against Zeros was defensive. Avoid them, run from them, survive long enough to get home. But what if you could attack them on your terms? What if you could dive on them from above, make a single pass at high speed, and then use that same speed to escape before they could react? It was, Eddie realized, exactly what Major Webb had been trying to teach them all along. Hit them fast, hit them hard, and get out. But Webb had never explained why this worked. He had never articulated the underlying principle. He had just told them to do it, and most pilots, Eddie included, had not fully understood. The theory needed testing. Eddie began experimenting during missions, pushing his P-40 to its limits, noting how the Zeros responded. He found that at speeds above 350, they consistently broke off. He found that attacks from high altitude, using dive speed to achieve separation, were far more survivable than attacks from level flight. He found that the Zeros, for all their agility, were predictable. They would always try to turn, always try to use their maneuverability, and this made them vulnerable to pilots who refused to play that game. In January 1943, Eddie shot down his first Zero. He came out of the sun at 400 miles per hour, fired a 2-second burst into the enemy's engine, and was gone before the Japanese pilot could react. The Zero spiraled into the ocean, trailing smoke. 2 weeks later, he got his second. A month after that, his third. By March 1943, Eddie Callahan had 5 confirmed kills. He was an ace, one of the few American pilots in the Pacific who could claim that distinction. And he had something else, a document. 20 pages of handwritten notes, diagrams, and tactical recommendations based on his observations and experiments. He called it Tactics Against the A6M Zero, a practical guide for fighter pilots. He submitted it to Major Webb with a request that it be forwarded to headquarters for review. Webb read it in silence, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he looked at Eddie for a long moment. "You wrote this yourself?" "Yes, sir." "Based on your own observations?" "And conversations with other pilots, sir. Everything I have learned in 6 months of combat." Webb set the document down on his desk. "Lieutenant, I have been flying fighters for 12 years. I have seen a lot of young pilots come through here with theories and ideas, most of them nonsense. But this," he tapped the pages, "this is not nonsense. This is good work. Thank you, sir. I will send it up the chain. I cannot promise anything. Headquarters has their own ideas about tactics, and they do not always listen to lieutenants from Wisconsin. But this deserves to be seen." Eddie saluted and left. He did not expect anything to come of it. What Eddie did not know was that his document would land on the desk of a man who had been thinking about the same problems for over a year. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch was a naval aviator, a fighter tactician, and one of the most innovative minds in American military aviation. Before the war, he had developed a defensive maneuver called the beam defense position, later known as the Thatch weave, specifically designed to counter the Zero's advantages. He had tested it in war games, refined it based on combat reports, and advocated for its adoption throughout the Navy and Marine Corps. Thatch's work was separate from Eddie's, developed independently through different methods and different experiences. But the underlying insight was the same. The Zero could be beaten by pilots who understood its limitations and refused to fight on its terms. When Eddie's document reached the intelligence staff at Pacific Fleet Headquarters in early April 1943, it was flagged by an analyst who recognized its significance. The document was copied, annotated, and forwarded to multiple commands, including Thatch's. Thatch read it with growing interest. Here was a pilot in the field with no access to classified intelligence or engineering data, who had independently arrived at conclusions that matched Thatch's own. The specifics were slightly different. Eddie focused on speed and dive tactics, while Thatch emphasized coordinated defensive maneuvering. But the fundamental principles were identical. Thatch made a note in the margin of Eddie's document: this man should be training pilots, not flying combat. The recommendation worked its way through channels. In June 1943, Eddie Callahan was pulled off combat duty and reassigned to a training squadron in Hawaii. His mission: teach new pilots how to survive against the Zero. Eddie protested at first. He had 7 kills now and he wanted to keep fighting. He wanted to avenge Bobby Chen and all the others he had watched die. Training replacements felt like a step backward, a waste of his skills. But the squadron commander in Hawaii, a commander named Patricia Reeves, one of the few women serving in a flight operations role, set him straight. "Lieutenant, do you know how many pilots we lose in their first 5 missions?" Eddie shook his head. 60%. 6 out of 10 men who arrive in the combat zone are dead or missing within their first month. Not because they are bad pilots, because nobody teaches them what you have figured out. She held up a copy of his document, now dog-eared from multiple readings. "This could save hundreds of lives, maybe thousands. You want to honor your friends who died? Teach the next generation how to live." Eddie taught. For the next 18 months, he trained fighter pilots at bases across Hawaii and the Central Pacific. He flew mock combat against students, demonstrating the tactics he had developed. He lectured in classrooms, using chalkboards and diagrams to explain the Zero's weaknesses. He grilled every returning combat pilot for new information, updating his recommendations as the war evolved. The impact was measurable. Squadrons that trained under Eddie's methods showed improved survival rates in their first engagements. Pilots who had internalized the principles of speed, altitude, and disciplined disengagement came home at higher rates than those who had not. The kill ratios, once catastrophically in favor of the Japanese, began to shift. Eddie was not the only reason for this shift. Better aircraft helped. The P-38 Lightning and F-6F Hellcat were both superior to the P-40 in many respects. Better pilot training across the board helped. The attrition of experienced Japanese pilots helped. The war was changing in ways that went far beyond one lieutenant's notebooks, but Eddie's contribution was real, and it was recognized. In November 1944, he received a letter of commendation from Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, acknowledging his exceptional contributions to fighter tactics and pilot training. The letter was classified and would remain so for decades, but Eddie kept a copy in his footlocker, reading it on nights when he wondered if any of it had mattered. The war ended in August 1945. Eddie Callahan was 25 years old, a captain now with 7 aerial victories and an estimated 500 pilots trained under his supervision. He had not seen combat in over 2 years, but the war had marked him in ways that would not fade. He returned to Wisconsin in October, taking the train from San Francisco through the mountains and across the plains, watching the American landscape unfold outside the window like a dream he had forgotten. His parents met him at the station in Eau Claire, his father, older now, stooped, his mother crying openly as she embraced him. "Welcome home, son," Patrick Callahan said. It was the most words he had spoken to Eddie in 4 years. Eddie tried to return to normal life. He helped on the farm through the winter, mending fences and milking cows as if the war had never happened. He reconnected with old friends, attended church with his family, went to dances in town where he stood awkwardly against the wall, unable to find words for the girls who smiled at him. He thought about using his GI Bill benefits to go to college. He thought about starting a business. He thought about a lot of things, but none of them felt real. What felt real was the sky. In the spring of 1946, Eddie used his savings to buy a surplus Stearman biplane, a trainer similar to the one he had learned to fly in a decade earlier. He set up a small flight school at a grass strip outside Eau Claire, teaching farmers' sons and returning veterans the basics of aviation. He was not a natural teacher on the ground. He was too quiet, too intense, too prone to long silences when words would have helped. But in the air, he was patient and precise, guiding students through maneuvers with a calm authority that inspired confidence. In 1948, he married a woman named Catherine Novak, a nurse from the Veterans Hospital in Madison, whom he had met at a church social. Catherine understood silence. She did not ask Eddie about the war, did not press him to share memories he was not ready to share. She simply loved him, and he loved her back in the quiet, steady way that was the only way he knew. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and raised them on a small property adjacent to the airstrip. The children grew up surrounded by airplanes, learning to fly before they learned to drive, inheriting their father's love of the sky without inheriting his memories of what the sky could become in wartime. Eddie never talked about the war to his children. He never showed them his medals or his commendations. He never told them about Bobby Chen or the rookies who had died in their first week, or the Japanese pilots he had killed. But he kept his notebooks, 3 battered volumes filled with cramped handwriting and faded diagrams, hidden in a trunk in the attic. And sometimes, late at night, when Catherine and the children were asleep, he would climb the narrow stairs to the attic and read through them, remembering. In 1987, Eddie's granddaughter, his oldest son's daughter, a journalism student named Sarah, asked if she could interview him for a class project on World War II veterans. Eddie, who was 67 years old and had never spoken publicly about his service, surprised everyone by agreeing. They sat in his living room, a tape recorder on the coffee table between them, and Sarah asked the questions her professor had suggested. What was it like? Were you scared? Did you lose friends? Eddie answered carefully, choosing his words the way he had once chosen flight paths, with precision, with awareness of consequences. He told her about Henderson Field. He told her about Bobby Chen. He told her about the rookie mistake that had nearly killed him. And then he told her something he had never told anyone. "I used to think about them," he said. "The Japanese pilots, the ones I shot down. 7 of them over 6 months. That is not many compared to some. But I knew that each one was a person, a son, maybe a husband, maybe a father, someone who loved the sky the same way I did. Sarah was silent, the tape recorder humming softly. For a long time I felt guilty about it. Not for fighting. The war had to be fought, and we were on the right side, but for the way I felt when I figured out how to beat them. I was excited, Sarah. I was proud. I had solved a puzzle, and the solution was going to help my friends survive. He looked out the window at the airstrip, where a student was practicing takeoffs and landings in a Cessna. It took me years to understand that both things could be true, that I could be proud of what I had accomplished and still mourn the people who died because of it. That is the weight of war. You carry it forever. Sarah reached out and took his hand. Was it worth it? All of it? Eddie considered the question for a long time. I do not know if that is the right way to think about it, he said finally. It was not a transaction. I did not trade something for something else. I did what I had to do in the moment with what I knew, and I have spent the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the chance I was given. He smiled a little sadly. That is all any of us can do, I think. Try to be worthy. Edward Joseph Callahan died in 2003 at the age of 83. He had operated his flight school until his 75th birthday, training 3 generations of pilots, watching the technology of aviation evolve from fabric-covered biplanes to jet engines and digital navigation. His funeral was held at the church where he had been baptized and married, attended by family, friends, former students, and a handful of veterans who remembered him from the old days. The minister spoke of service and sacrifice. The honor guard fired their rifles into the Wisconsin sky. Afterward, Sarah, now a journalist in her 40s, gave a short eulogy. She talked about her grandfather's quiet strength, his love of the sky, his dedication to teaching, and she read a passage from one of his notebooks, discovered in the attic after his death. The enemy is not a target. The enemy is a pilot like you with dreams and fears and people who love him. When you understand this, you understand the true cost of victory. And when you understand the true cost of victory, you fight harder to make sure it was worth paying. The passage had been written in December 1942 on Guadalcanal by a 22-year-old lieutenant who had just survived his first month of combat. It had never been published, never been shared, never been seen by anyone outside the family. But it captured something essential about Eddie Callahan and about the generation he represented. They fought because they had to, they won because they learned, and they carried the weight of that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Sarah donated her grandfather's notebooks to the National Museum of the United States Air Force, where they are now part of the permanent collection. A small placard beside them reads, "These notebooks represent the tactical observations of Captain Edward J. Callahan, USAAF, whose independent analysis of the A6M Zero's limitations contributed to improved American fighter tactics in the Pacific Theater, 1943-1945. Captain Callahan is credited with 7 aerial victories and the training of approximately 500 fighter pilots during the war." What the placard does not say, what no placard could say, is that those notebooks represent something more than tactics. They represent a young man learning that survival required understanding, that victory required sacrifice, and that wisdom meant holding both truths at once. They remind us that in war, as in life, the greatest breakthroughs often come from those who ask simple questions that others have overlooked. And they remind us that even a rookie mistake, in the right hands, can become the foundation for something extraordinary. If this story moved you, help it reach more people by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Share in the comments what touched you most and from which country you are watching. These memories stay alive when we tell them together. The pilots of World War II faced impossible odds, and the stories of their courage, their ingenuity, and their humanity deserve to be remembered, not as legends but as people, not as heroes but as men and women who found a way to do what needed to be done. Until next time, thank you for listening. And remember, look up at the sky today. Someone, somewhere, fought to keep it free.